MacArthur told Eichelberger 4 words before sending him to Buna: "Take it, or don't come back." Not a metaphor, not the dramatic language generals use to motivate their subordinates. An order. And behind that order there was something MacArthur didn't explain to Eichelberger. Something that no intelligence report, no topographical map, and no aerial photograph could fully capture. What waited at Buna was different from anything the Allies had faced in the Pacific up to that point. I spent weeks going through Eichelberger's declassified memoirs, campaign diaries at the Australian War Memorial, and official histories of the New Guinea campaign to bring you this documentary. What you're about to hear doesn't appear in MacArthur's biographies. Only in the archives his officers published after he could no longer silence them. Buna and Gona were 2 coastal villages on the northeastern coast of Papua New Guinea. Nobody outside the region had ever heard of them before 1942. But in November 1942, they were the most important piece of ground in the South Pacific. They were Japan's logistical gateway in Papua, the only place where troops, ammunition, and food could reach the island. If Buna fell, the Japanese offensive along the Kokoda track was finished. The threat to Port Moresby disappeared, and the Allied counteroffensive in the Southwest Pacific could begin. MacArthur needed it, not just strategically, politically. Months of setbacks in the Pacific. Months of headlines that didn't reflect the progress Washington expected. MacArthur needed a victory. He needed it fast. And Buna was that victory. The problem was what the Japanese had built there. The Japanese positions at Buna are described in every Allied report of the period with the same word: invisible. Bunkers of logs and sand capable of withstanding light artillery. A network of connected tunnels. If you took one bunker, the others kept firing. Machine guns in crossed positions that covered every centimetre of open ground. Sniper towers in the trees. Improvised minefields. And on top of all that, vegetation so dense that you couldn't see a Japanese position until you were literally on top of it. Allied reports described it the same way again and again. Literally impossible to see until you were right on them. But the architecture of the defences was only half the problem. The terrain was the worst possible for an assault. Swamps, mud that sucked you into the waist, advance measured in meters per day on a good day, weapons rendered useless by constant moisture, 34 degrees of temperature with 90% humidity, clothing that never dried, skin infections, fungal disease, exhaustion that made malaria and dysentery seem like minor inconveniences. Disease casualties exceeded combat casualties from day one. It was one of the worst battlefields in the Pacific. And toward that battlefield, MacArthur sent 2 completely different forces. The Australians, veterans of the Kokoda track, the 7th Division, the 16th Brigade and the 25th Brigade men who had spent months in the Papua jungle, who knew what it was to fight in that terrain, who had learned at Isarava and Eora Creek and Templeton's Crossing how to survive in conditions no manual described. Exhausted, worn down, but with something that can't be trained. Real experience. And the Americans, the 32nd Infantry Division, the 126th and 128th Infantry Regiments. Without real combat experience, without specific jungle training, arriving directly from the United States into one of the worst battlefields in the world. They were brave. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what MacArthur expected them to do with that bravery. November 1942. The first weeks of the campaign, the 32nd Division attacked Buna frontally for 3 weeks. They didn't take a meter. Japanese machine guns from invisible positions in the vegetation cut down every advance before it reached anywhere. Bunkers that the terrain made impossible to identify at distance survived everything thrown at them. Men died in swamps without ever seeing the enemy killing them. MacArthur, from his headquarters in Brisbane, looked at the operational reports and made a decision. He needed someone at the front to sort things out. Someone who would make the attacks work. Someone he could blame if they didn't. And that was how Robert Eichelberger received the 4 words that would define the weeks ahead. Take it, or don't come back alive. Douglas MacArthur never set foot in Buna. He commanded the entire campaign from Brisbane, 1,500 kilometres from the front. In an office with maps on the walls and telephones on the desk and no possibility of hearing the sound of a Japanese machine gun firing from an invisible bunker in the swamps. From there, his orders were perfectly logical. Advance without delay. Close with the enemy now. The Japanese are exhausted. Their positions are not strong. At the front, those words read aloud produced a specific silence. The silence of men who had spent days watching their mates die in front of bunkers they couldn't see, in swamps that sucked them into the waist, with rifles made useless by constant moisture. The Japanese are exhausted. Their positions are not strong. An American officer wrote in his report something that no MacArthur communique ever acknowledged. We could not even see the bunkers until they opened fire. It wasn't lack of courage, it wasn't lack of aggression, it was physics. Logs are metre thick, interconnected positions linked by tunnels. Camouflage so perfect that a soldier could be 10 metres from a bunker and not know it was there. And crossed machine guns covering every centimetre of open ground between the vegetation and the Japanese positions. Advancing in a line through a swamp toward that wasn't an attack. It was an execution. The 32nd Infantry Division had arrived from the United States without real combat experience. It wasn't their fault. They were brave soldiers in a situation nobody had prepared them for. They didn't know infiltration. They didn't know patrolling in dense vegetation. They didn't know how to detect camouflaged Japanese positions. They had never seen a bunker built to withstand light artillery. And they were being sent to attack frontally positions that the Kokoda veterans already knew couldn't be taken that way. The figures from the first weeks couldn't be interpreted any other way. One American battalion lost 70% of its strength in 2 weeks. Not in a single battle, in 2 weeks of attacks ordered from Brisbane that produced the same result every time. Men advancing through swamps toward invisible machine guns. Men falling without having seen the enemy killing them. For every Japanese soldier killed in a frontal assault, the Allies were losing between 5 and 10 men. 800 Americans dead, 2,800 wounded or evacuated through illness. On some days, 75% of an entire battalion was too sick to fight. MacArthur, from Brisbane, had an explanation for all of this. His men lacked aggressive spirit. They were not trying hard enough. That's what he wrote in his internal communications. That's what he told General Harding, commander of the 32nd Division. Harding, who was obeying impossible orders and sending his men to die in unprepared attacks because MacArthur would not accept delays. The situation had been deteriorating for weeks when MacArthur made the decision that would define the rest of the campaign. The 30th of November, 1942. MacArthur called Robert Eichelberger. What he said is documented word for word in the memoirs Eichelberger published years later, when MacArthur could no longer silence them. Go to Buna, take Buna, or don't come back alive. And then 3 additional instructions that define exactly how MacArthur understood the problem. If Harding can't do the job, relieve him. I want you to take direct command. I want no alibis. Eichelberger was a competent and experienced officer. He wasn't the kind of man that difficult orders sent into a panic. But what he found when he arrived at the front left him speechless. Not because the men were failing, but because the real situation had no relationship whatsoever to what MacArthur had described to him from Brisbane. Eichelberger wrote it in his memoirs. Our casualties were shocking. Attacks ordered from the rear were impossible to execute on the ground. Ordered from the rear. Those 3 words say everything. Because while MacArthur was ordering immediate frontal attacks from Brisbane, there was an Australian general at the front who had spent weeks watching exactly what Eichelberger had just seen, and who had already reached very different conclusions about how to take Buna. His name was George Vasey. There are generals whose men respect them, and there are generals whose men would follow them anywhere. George Vasey was the second kind. Gallipoli veteran, the trenches of France in the First World War, Greece and Syria in 1941. Decades of war on the worst terrain the 20th century had produced up to that point. Commander of the 7th Australian Division in New Guinea. And known throughout the Australian Army for three things: direct to the point of discomfort, sarcastic with anyone who said something stupid, and absolutely ferociously protective of his troops. Many Australian soldiers considered him the most human general in the army. Not because he was soft, but because when he sent his men to do something, he had already calculated exactly what it was going to cost them, and if the cost had no tactical justification, he refused. Regardless of who had given the order, Vasey had spent weeks at Buna watching the same thing Eichelberger had just seen when he arrived from MacArthur's office in Brisbane. The difference was that Vasey already had a very clear opinion about what needed to be done about it. When Eichelberger arrived at the front with his orders, take direct command, attack immediately, no alibis, Vasey didn't give him a briefing over a map. He took him for a walk. Not in a jeep, not in a helicopter, on foot. Through pools of waist-deep mud, past the bodies that the frontal attacks of the previous weeks had left in no man's land. Past the sick men who could no longer stand unaided but who were still in position because there wasn't enough personnel to evacuate them, Eichelberger saw Japanese bunkers that from 50 meters were completely invisible under the vegetation. He saw the fields of fire the Japanese machine guns covered, all the open ground any attacker would have to cross, without cover, without dead ground, without anywhere to hide. And then Vasey stopped. He pointed at the terrain in front of them, and told Eichelberger something that no Brisbane report had captured. Now tell me which direction you want to attack. Eichelberger didn't answer, because there was no answer. Not from Brisbane, not from any map in any office 1,500 kilometres from the front. The answer was here, in this swamp, looking at what Vasey had been looking at for weeks. Vasey added two sentences that Australian officers' diaries recorded with the precision of men who heard them in person. I will not throw Australians against bunkers I haven't even seen. This is not a road, it's a swamp full of Japanese. It wasn't a confrontation, it was something more uncomfortable than a confrontation. It was the moment when an American general with direct orders from MacArthur looked at the reality of the terrain and understood that the Australian man standing next to him had been right from the beginning. The Australians had learned at Kokoda something that the 32nd American Division had no time to learn in any training camp. That the Japanese in defensive jungle positions cannot be beaten by direct assault? Never. The first difference was reconnaissance. Before attacking any position, the Australians sent patrols to identify exactly every bunker, locate the fields of fire, detect the sniper positions in the trees, find the weak points in the Japanese defensive network. The Americans were going in blind, attacking positions they hadn't reconnoitred because MacArthur wouldn't accept the delays that reconnaissance required. The second difference was the direction of attack. The Australians didn't attack frontally. They sent small groups, 6-10 men, on deep flanking movements through the jungle. They looked for the weak points in the geometry of the Japanese defences. The same points you could only find if you took the time to look instead of advancing in a line through a swamp. The third difference was pace. One bunker at a time, advance by sections, use grenades and sustained fire and short manoeuvres, build support positions before each attack, dig in, raise parapets, establish ammunition lines, wait for the right moment instead of attacking because Brisbane wouldn't accept delays. And when the first Stuart M3 tanks arrived, the Australians insisted on using them as part of a supported system, not as isolated battering rams that the infantry followed blindly, as part of a tactical system where each element covered the next. Eichelberger listened to all of this, and made the only decision that made sense after seeing the terrain with his own eyes. He stopped following MacArthur's orders for immediate frontal attacks, reorganised the front, and started doing what Vasey had been telling anyone who would listen needed to be done. Eichelberger arrived at the front with orders from MacArthur. He came out of his walk with Vasey with a different conclusion. MacArthur's orders couldn't be executed on that terrain, not because the men were failing, but because the doctrine was wrong for the battlefield in front of them. The first thing Eichelberger did was what MacArthur had ordered. He relieved the American commanders who weren't performing, regrouped the scattered units, restored trench discipline, and coordinated fire. But the second thing he did is what MacArthur never acknowledged in any official report. He stopped ordering frontal attacks. Instead, he adopted exactly what Vasey had been doing for weeks. Exhaustive reconnaissance before every movement, groups of 6 to 10 men advancing on flanks instead of full lines charging through swamps, one bunker at a time, detect, flank, fix with fire, destroy with grenades. No mass assaults, no blind advances toward invisible machine guns. Fine surgery instead of slaughter. And when the Stuart M3 tanks arrived, the first tanks sent to New Guinea, the Australians insisted on using them in the only way that made sense in that terrain. Not as isolated battering rams, as part of a system where infantry guided the tanks toward the bunkers identified in prior reconnaissance, and the tanks destroyed what the infantry couldn't open. The tanks used that way worked. The ones that weren't got bogged in the mud. The successful attacks at Gona always followed the same pattern. Australian patrols guiding, American infantry executing, American tanks opening gaps in the hardest bunkers, Australian mortars fixing targets. Not Australians alone, not Americans alone. Both armies doing what each knew how to do best, with Australian jungle doctrine as the basis of every movement. Gona fell on the 9th of December 1942. Buna on the 2nd of January 1943. Sanananda on the 22nd of January 1943. Not in 1 or 2 days as MacArthur had promised Washington. In 7 weeks of systematic reduction bunker by bunker. And when the last Japanese positions fell, what the Allies found inside explained why it had taken 7 weeks with the right doctrine and hadn't advanced a metre in 3 weeks with the wrong one. The Japanese defenders were out of ammunition, out of food, dying of malaria and dysentery, unable to evacuate by sea because the Allied Navy controlled the coastal routes. They had been starving inside their bunkers while they held out. And still, they had held out. 5,500 Japanese dead, 50 prisoners. Almost all the rest had fought until they died. The Allied casualties at Gona tell 2 different stories depending on which period of the campaign you look at. In the weeks of frontal attacks ordered from Brisbane before Eichelberger adopted Australian doctrine, the ratio was catastrophic. Between 5 and 10 Allied casualties for every Japanese soldier neutralised. Some American companies lost 70 or 80% of their strength. 800 Americans dead, 2,800 wounded or evacuated through illness. But here's the contrast that MacArthur's official reports never put on the same page. When Eichelberger changed the tactics, when he stopped following the frontal attacks, when he started operating the way the Australians had been telling him for weeks was the way to operate, the casualty rate changed. It didn't disappear. Gona was never a cheap campaign. But the slaughter of the first weeks became something that at least had tactical logic. Men dying to destroy specific positions identified beforehand, not men dying because MacArthur wouldn't accept the delays that reconnaissance required. Eichelberger wrote about the Australians after the campaign with a clarity that no MacArthur communique would ever have approved. The Australians were the finest jungle fighters I ever saw. They understood the enemy and the country better than we did. Vasey and his men had the right instincts. They knew how to fight this war. And one sentence that summarizes everything that happened at Gona with the economy that only comes from someone who was there and saw both versions of the campaign. We Americans learned from the Australians how to take Buna. MacArthur, from Brisbane, received the reports of Gona's fall and presented them as a victory of his strategic planning. The men who had taken the positions bunker by bunker in the worst swamps of the Pacific knew exactly what that meant, and said nothing. Because saying nothing was what the alliance required. Gona didn't appear in the great narratives of the Second World War. It doesn't have the dramatic weight of Midway, it doesn't have the scale of Guadalcanal, it doesn't have the recognizable name of Iwo Jima. But what changed in the Pacific after Buna is in every Allied operation that came after. Because after Buna, MacArthur stopped ordering frontal attacks against fortified Japanese positions. Not because he had decided it on his own, but because the casualties of the first weeks of campaign had left a lesson impossible to ignore even from Brisbane. Direct assaults against Japanese jungle bunkers didn't work. What worked was surrounding, isolating, cutting the logistics, advancing through weak points instead of hammering the strong ones. That doctrine, which the Australians had been applying since Kokoda became the foundation of every Allied operation in the Southwest Pacific from 1943 onward. Lae, Salamaua, Nadzab, Hollandia. In each of those operations, the pattern was the same. Amphibious leaps, surround the Japanese garrisons, let them starve and die of disease instead of destroying them bunker by bunker. A strategy that saved Allied lives. A strategy the Australians already knew was right long before MacArthur adopted it. After Buna, the American Army established jungle combat schools in the Pacific. The training program copied Australian tactics. The Australian doctrine of infiltration, prior reconnaissance and gradual reduction of positions became the model taught to American divisions before each new operation. What Vasey had explained to Eichelberger in a Papua swamp had become official doctrine. Buna left two things between the two armies: tension and respect, both at the same time. The Australians were deeply resentful of something that wasn't tactical but political. MacArthur publicly claimed credit for the success of Buna. His press communiques described the campaign as a victory of his strategic planning. The Australian brigades that had done most of the bunker-by-bunker work in the hardest swamps of the Pacific appeared in those communiques as a secondary detail. The Australian officers who had been at the front knew exactly what that meant. And they stayed quiet, because staying quiet was what the alliance required. But the military respect was real, and it was concrete. Eichelberger, who had arrived in Papua with orders to replace the Australians, left the campaign as one of their most convinced advocates. The Australians were the finest jungle fighters I ever saw. They understood the enemy and the country better than we did. The Australians showed us how to fight this war. And MacArthur, who from Brisbane had accused his own men of lacking aggressive spirit, started using the Australian brigades as the tactical core of every subsequent operation in New Guinea. He never said so in any official communique. But the order of battle for 1943 and 1944 said it for him. George Vasey kept commanding the 7th Division, Lae Nadzab. The Huon Peninsula Campaign. Operation after operation in New Guinea, applying the same doctrine he had defended in the swamps of Buna when nobody in Brisbane would listen. He was promoted. He was one of the most respected military figures in Australia. On the 5th of March 1945, his Hudson aircraft fell into the sea near Cairns. George Vasey died without having received the international recognition he deserved. In Australia, he is a revered figure. Outside Australia, he is almost unknown. History has a very specific way of treating the generals who were right but didn't write their own press releases. Robert Eichelberger kept rising. Hollandia, Leyte, Manila, some of the most complex operations in the Pacific in 1944 and 1945. He finished the war as a 4-star general, one of the most prestigious commanders of his generation. And he published his memoirs years after the war, with sentences that no American officer had written about the Australians with that clarity before. The Australians taught us how to fight in the jungle. The Buna campaign has one characteristic that distinguishes it from almost any other Allied operation of the Second World War. The men who won it are not the same men who received the credit for winning it. The 7th Australian Division consolidated at Buna, a reputation that within the Australian Army never needed any press release to sustain itself. They were the finest jungle combat force in the Pacific. The Japanese who faced them knew it. The Americans who fought alongside them knew it. Eichelberger knew it. He'd arrived with orders to replace them and left admiring them. The only ones who didn't quite know it were the world outside the Pacific. Because MacArthur controlled what the world outside the Pacific read about the campaign, the men who came out of the Buna swamps went home to Victoria and Queensland and New South Wales, back to their farms and factories and offices. Many never talked about what they had done there. Not because they had nothing to say, but because what they had done was too specific and too brutal to translate into dinner table conversation. They had learned to take Japanese bunkers one by one in swamps that sucked you into the waist. And they had had to teach it to the Americans while a general in Brisbane told them they weren't trying hard enough. There's something about this story that MacArthur's official reports never captured. Not the casualties, not the bunkers taken, not the tactical doctrine that Gona changed forever in the Pacific. It's this. An Australian general took an American general for a walk through a swamp. He showed him exactly what MacArthur couldn't see from Brisbane, and said 3 words that no official report recorded precisely, but that every officer present remembered for the rest of their lives. Now, tell me which direction you want to attack. Eichelberger didn't answer, because the answer was already there, in that swamp, in those invisible bunkers, in the Australian men who had spent weeks doing what no order from Brisbane had managed to understand. Vasey was right from the beginning, and the history of the Pacific proves it in every Allied operation that came after Gona. There's another story just as buried as this one. A group of Australians who also had to prove something to their allies that no manual had captured yet, in different terrain, with an outcome that changed something bigger than a single campaign. It's in the next video.